Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a truly mind-bending historical mystery. Right now, there are roughly 400 million people across Latin America who share a common language, a shared religion, and 300 years of deeply intertwined history. Yet, despite having all of this in common, they completely failed to become a single united country. And honestly, that failure completely shaped the global geopolitical map we live with today.
So why did this happen? Well, let's dive into it, because to figure this out, we have to look at a moment when the future of an entire continent hung in the balance, depending on just two men in one single room. If those two had agreed, history would look completely different, but they didn't, and everything fell apart.
It's a massive paradox when you really think about it. Compare the original 13 U.S. colonies to the Spanish colonies. The Spanish colonies actually had far more in common than the original American colonies ever did. They had a heavily centralized, shared language, religion, and deep cultural history. Yet, while the U.S. managed to unite, Latin America shattered into dozens of separate pieces.
Section 1. The Spanish Empire's Flaw. To understand why it all unraveled, we have to rewind a bit. 300 years, to be exact. For 3 centuries, Spain tried to run a territory bigger than all of Europe combined, and they tried to do it from one single city, Madrid. A simple letter took 3 months just to arrive by ship. But physical distance actually wasn't the biggest issue here. It was a deeply unfair social system. This system created a furious class of people known as criollos. These were people of Spanish descent, but simply because they happened to be born in the Americas, they were treated as second-class citizens.
Just think about the sheer inequality of this setup. If you were born in Spain, you got all the top jobs. You were the governors, the generals, the judges. But if you were born in the Americas, even if you were incredibly wealthy and practically owned half the countryside, you were completely barred from real power. Every time a ship arrived from Spain, it brought these fresh-faced nobodies right off the boat, and they instantly outranked locals whose families had lived, worked, and built the region for 200 years. Talk about a recipe for resentment.
Section 2. Napoleon's Accidental Revolution.
So, this anger among the criollos had been bubbling under the surface decade after decade. But the match that actually lit the powder keg? It was a short French emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, executed a plan to take over Spain that was so sneaky, it literally sounds like a cartoon villain scheme. Step 1. Invite the Spanish king to a friendly meeting in France. Step 2. Throw him in prison. Step 3. Put his own brother, Joseph, on the Spanish throne. You can't make this stuff up. And this created a massive historic loophole for those furious criollos. With the real king kidnapped, they figured, hey, we can just set up our own local councils, called juntas, and govern ourselves in his name.
But as you might guess, the early years of the revolution were a total massive infighting and incredibly bad luck. Almost immediately, in 1811, Buenos Aires tried to force Paraguay to join them. They were invading their own neighbors before they'd even finished fighting Spain. Then came a devastating earthquake in Caracas in 1812. Fast forward to 1814, Napoleon gets defeated in Europe, the Spanish king is freed, and by 1815, Spain is sending heavily armed warships to crush the rebellions. At that point, the dream looked completely dead and buried.
And we really shouldn't underestimate the psychological blow of that 1812 earthquake. Imagine being a terrified survivor in Caracas. You're standing in the rubble, and there's a royalist priest yelling, "God is angry. You turned against your king, and this is what happens." People genuinely believed it. Soldiers deserted, whole towns switched sides, and that specific rebellion basically collapsed almost overnight.
Section 3. Crossing the Impossible Mountains.
Right when all hope seemed lost, on opposite ends of the continent, 2 totally different generals decided to execute the most ridiculous military plan anyone had ever heard of. José de San Martín from the south and Simón Bolívar from the north. They realized they needed an impossible surprise attack. The plan? Haul their armies over the deadly, freezing Andes Mountains. We are literally talking about dragging 5,000 soldiers and heavy artillery through frozen passes above 10,000 feet. People died just trying to walk across the Andes normally. San Martín even had to deal with stubborn mules carrying cannons that would just sit down in the snow and refuse to move. But because the plan was supposedly impossible, the Spanish absolutely never expected it. Both generals crashed down from the mountains, stunned the Spanish armies, and started freeing massive stretches of territory.
Section 4. One Continent, Two Visions.
So these two men had just freed half a continent, which leads us to one massive historical moment. In July 1822, these two heroes finally meet face-to-face in Guayaquil, Ecuador. But Bolivar had arrived weeks early, completely filling the city with his own soldiers and flags, so when the much quieter San Martín finally arrived, he walked straight into a psychological setup.
Now, they both desperately wanted unity, but they completely clashed on how to actually govern. Bolivar's vision was a republic, strongly centralized in Bogotá, and he firmly believed he worked best alone. San Martin, on the other hand, thought they needed a neutral European prince to keep everyone happy. He was even willing to serve under Bolivar just to finish the war, but Bolivar refused to help. Realizing there was just no room for him, San Martin walked out of that room a broken man, boarded a ship in the dark, and sailed away to Europe forever.
So, with San Martin out of the picture, Bolivar gets to work. He actually successfully merges several nations into this massive super country called Gran Colombia. But the peace lasted all of 2 years. The different regions were completely tired of the capital, Bogotá, bossing them around. Venezuela wanted out. Ecuador wanted out. And in response, Bolivar made a fatal mistake trying to hold it all together. He declared himself dictator.
The thing is, nobody fights a brutal revolution against a distant king just to hand all their power over to a distant president who's acting exactly like one. The super country cracked apart. By 1830, Bolivar is exhausted, dying of a lung disease, and he realizes all those frozen mountain passes had basically been for nothing. He famously and tragically lamented, "He who serves a revolution plows the sea."
Section 5. The Brazilian Exception.
So at this point, it seemed like unity in South America was just completely impossible. But right next door, there was one place on the entire continent that somehow held together perfectly. And the reason why is absolutely wild. Remember when Napoleon invaded Europe? Well, the Portuguese royal family did something the Spanish royals never thought of. They ran away. In 1808, they packed up the entire royal court, jumped on ships, and sailed directly across the ocean to Brazil. They opened ports, built schools, and literally made Rio de Janeiro the new center of the entire Portuguese empire.
The king's son, Prince Dom Pedro, actually grew up running the streets of Rio. He felt entirely Brazilian. So in 1821, when the Portuguese parliament ordered him back to Lisbon to demote Brazil back to a regular colony, he flat out refused. He declared independence or death in 1822 and kept his massive country whole. Why did it work? Because unlike the Spanish colonies, the Brazilian people actually liked having a unifying, familiar figure right there on the throne.
Section 6. Why the Dream Died.
So unlike Brazil, which had that one unifying prince, the Spanish colonies had an empty throne and a whole continent full of generals who all wanted to sit in it. Ultimately, the dream of unity died due to 3 massive hurdles. First, the caudillos. These were tough, ruthless military strongmen who absolutely refused to share power. Second, geography. We're talking an unforgiving landscape of impassable Andes Mountains, the massive Amazon jungle, and vast deserts. Basic communication was almost impossible. And third, British interference. Foreign powers actively signed separate trade deals and encouraged rivalries to keep these new nations divided, making them far easier to control.
Which leaves us with this massive historical what-if. How totally different would the world look today if Bolivar and San Martin had actually managed to agree in that one room back in 1822? If those 2 men had walked out of Guayaquil as allies instead of rivals, could a united Latin America have changed the entire course of modern history? It's a fascinating question, and one that history will forever leave unanswered. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history you think you know.